So under the cloak of darkness, they then drove around 15 kilometers down Baden-Powell Drive, and in the desolate surroundings, quite close to the Strandfontein Pavilion, they then buried the body. And welcome to episode 6 of Makeup and Mayhem True Crime with me, Bella Monsoon. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and the motives that drive people to do what they do. So what this means is that every single True Crime Thursday or Freaky Friday, I post a new video that looks at the psychological motives behind a real life crime and delves a little bit deeper into why people do what they do. Whilst this is all going on, I also complete a bomb makeup look that is super easy to follow, and I show you every single product I use throughout the video. So throughout each episode, I also try to teach you some pretty cool psychological concepts that you may or may not already know, and I think these are pretty awesome to store in your knowledge bank to casually drop at that next cocktail party, or in the cases of the world we're living in right now, Zoom party. So just a quick disclaimer for today's story. This story does contain material that may not be suitable for all audiences, and there is subject matter citing violence, child neglect, suicide, and drug use. As always, I will issue further warnings as the story unfolds. So I mean absolutely no disrespect to the individuals or their families that are mentioned within the story, and the purpose of this video is simply to educate and to spread awareness of the events that took place. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real photographs as well as real life accounts from individuals who were involved directly in this case. So, without further ado, on to episode 6. So, today's episode kind of stands in stark contrast to last week's episode 5, The Springs House of Horrors. If you haven't yet seen it, I will link a card up above so you can check it out. But that episode focused on the children who were the victims in the situation, and whilst in today's episode the children are victims in many ways, they were the perpetrators of the crime that was committed. Although this crime took place in 2013, I think it's quite important to go back a little bit further so that you as the viewer can fully understand and get a full idea of the events that led up to the crime that shook the Deep South. In 1994, Phoenix Racing Cloud Theron was born in Noordhoek, Cape Town. From the time of her birth, her parents were always free spirits who shunned the idea of a normal suburban life. Her mother was 20 years old at the time of her birth, and she was essentially a hippie drifter who lived in a caravan and traveled from festival to festival. Her dad was pretty much part of the same world, and together the three of them traveled and lived in a caravan. So at times they would even abandon the comfort of the caravan to travel in a wooden rickety cart that was drawn by horses, and they would travel with this around the country, and they would sell their hand-sewn puppets. So during this time they would also camp out in abandoned vehicles and buildings. So during this time they would also be smoking marijuana, and they would be using psychedelics on a regular basis. So as you can probably imagine, during this time not much attention was spent looking after Phoenix, as her parents found themselves preoccupied with finding themselves, ironically. So this level of neglect at such a young age would go on to affect her in a multitude of different ways, both psychologically, emotionally, and behaviorally as she grew up. She was only 3 years old when her parents' relationship abruptly ended, and she ended up living in a caravan with her mother on a community farm somewhere in Neisner. So during this time as a young child, Phoenix actually remembers how she went hungry many a day whilst her mother meditated for hours on end. So it didn't take more than a few years, and around the year 2000, her mother, Rosemary, abruptly left her with her father and took off for a new adventure in South America. So although her father was more stable than the mother, she was, however, exposed to his adult friends often, and one of them would later sexually abuse her. So her abuse at such a young age began with, as I mentioned, one of her father's friends, but later it was her grandmother's boyfriend who would also sexually violate her. So it was just about a year after her mother had abandoned her when she returned to South Africa and she was pregnant. And Phoenix was around 6 years old when her baby brother was born outside of the caravan that they lived in. So his father was obviously still in South America, and he was later named Taki. So at this point in time, her mother moved herself and her brother into a clapped out bus in the Oudermolen Eco Village in Cape Town. So this is essentially a piece of land near the city center, and what has happened here is that they've converted an old abandoned hospital complex into a space where micro enterprises and non-profit organizations can exist. So as you can imagine, the first few years of Phoenix's life were far from stable. So Rosemary once again fell pregnant in 2005, and Phoenix's sister Shariel was born when Phoenix was 11 years old and her brother Taki was 4. So upon returning from the hospital after the birth, the baby was passed off to Phoenix, and this would become a pattern for the years to come. So Phoenix essentially became the mother in the home, feeding, caring, washing up after her 2 younger siblings, while her mother continued to live her hippie lifestyle. Responsibilities that she was left to undertake were far greater than many children her age had to deal with, and this greatly impacted her development into a healthy, well-adjusted young adult. So in addition to this, her primary school years were a mixture of homeschooling, self-schooling, and no schooling at all. This lack of schooling was also as a result of her mother not paying school fees and then her having to leave the school. So as she moved between her parents quite often and there was no real emphasis placed on formal education, it was quite difficult for her to establish any sense of educational normality. Keeping all of this in mind, she was determined, and she actually ended up teaching herself grade 3 using the Clonard homeschooling system. So a few years later, Rosemary actually got married, and she married a man in which a incredibly toxic relationship developed, and Phoenix was then witness, as with the other children, to much emotional and physical abuse. The police were called out multiple times to take this man away, but each and every time he would still end up returning back into their home and back into their lives. So after many years of looking after her siblings, she was then sent to live with her father at the age of 16, and there she began in grade 10 in Neisner High School after leaving Fishhook High School. So at this point, now that she was finally away from all the family responsibilities she had to undertake, she began to act out. Keep in mind, she was also a teenager at this point, and so she began to use drugs, she began to smoke, and she began to have unprotected sex. Although some of this behavior can obviously be chalked up to normal teenage rebellion, Other parts of this behavior are definitely characteristic of an individual who has been abused and neglected in their childhood. So during this time though, she was actually a really good, if not brilliant student according to her father, and she passed matric with 2 A's and several B's, which is pretty good. So she was editor of the school newspaper, she had attended several leadership camps, and she even volunteered at Rape Crisis and other NGOs that assisted people living in townships. So it was also around this point that her path crossed with a young man by the name of Kyle Maspero. And this meeting would forever change both of their lives. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Kyle Maspero. So Kyle Maspero came from a broken home, and his mother had actually passed away when he was 5 years old. He had then lived temporarily with other extended family, and then he also stayed during this time in 2 different foster homes. So during this time he became addicted to tuk, also known as crystal meth, and he was expelled from school in 2011 due to his drug use. He then found placement in another school, but he was expelled after a short period of time after he was caught stealing on more than one occasion, probably to fund his drug habit. He then did a small stint in rehab, and another school accepted him. So they had accepted him on the basis that he would stay clean, and once it was discovered that he was indeed using again, he was then expelled. He was described by that principal as a troubling and challenging child. So at this point he entered his 3rd foster home, where he was really well received and really well loved. His foster father is actually a writer who lives in Neisner, and during this time he started a photography course, and he was generally quite well liked by everyone who had taught him during this course. So in January of 2013 though, he decided to leave his foster family's home and leave the garden route and move to Cape Town with Phoenix, who had at this stage discovered that she was pregnant. At the time of this discovery, they had been in a relationship and romance for several months now. So they then both moved in with Rosemary and Shariel, who was 8 years old at the time. The previous year, 2012, Taki had been sent to South America to live with his father, whom he did not know well at all. So Phoenix then had the pregnancy terminated, and she went on to stay with Kyle in the Clovelly home. So Clovelly is a suburb in the southern peninsula of Cape Town, and it is quite close to Fisher. So now we get to the day of the crime. So it was March 2013, and the young couple had been staying for a couple of weeks now with Rosemary. But ever since they moved in, there had seemed to be quite a lot of conflict between Kyle and Rosemary, to the point where she had even asked them to leave a few weeks prior, which they had done. They had then gone and started camping on the mountainside. However, after having all of their belongings stolen, they felt incredibly unsafe, and they had asked if they could come back. So here we are on the 17th of March 2013. So the morning ritual for both Kyle and Phoenix was to smoke a morning joint, and thereafter Kyle would often smoke tuk. So Rosemary actually hated having tuk in the house. Both Shariel and Taki's father had had substance abuse issues, particularly with crystal meth, so it was something she disliked intensely. Phoenix often felt that her mother shouldn't comment on this, given the fact that she had used a lot of drugs in her past too. So this is how the days would pass for the young couple, with not much planned. So a few hours into that morning, around 11 a.m., is when Rosemary woke up. So during this time, Rosemary was working gigs as a stilt walker and clown at parties, and so she would often have late nights, and so she would sleep in later into the day. So she woke up because Kyle had been cleaning in the kitchen and the banging of the pots and pans had disturbed her sleep. She was quite irritated when she woke up and she voiced that irritation with Kyle. So it is at this point that Shariel, Phoenix's little sister, woke up and she was quite upset by the arguing. Kyle then took Shariel to Phoenix to comfort her. Rosemary had then returned to the room and she was on her computer. So then Phoenix approached her mother in her room and she spoke to her about sending Shariel to school, something that she had often spoken to her about. So her mom laughed off any discussion about sending Shariel back to school. She was currently homeschooling her, as she said she was just going to run away again. Phoenix was quite bothered by this because she knew that when she was in school, Rosemary used to tell her that her teachers were evil and the other kids were weird, and she didn't want the same for Shariel. She wanted Shariel to get an education like she had when she was living with her father. So Rosemary couldn't understand often why Phoenix would argue with her, as she missed the happy-go-lucky child that used to travel on the road with her, but she seemed to lack the insight to understand that Phoenix had grown up and she had started to see her childhood in a different light. During this point, her mother continued to do her makeup as she had a gig out in Claremont later that day. So after she had left the house, Kyle had made breakfast for Shariel and he had come back to the room with Phoenix and they had smoked a joint whilst discussing what a bad mother Rosemary was. So it was at that point in time that Kyle had admitted that it would be better if her mother just wasn't around at all. And it was after a short pause that Phoenix had agreed. And this is where the plan was set in motion. So at the end of the day, Rosemary had gotten a lift home and she was dropped outside of their property in Clovelly. And that is the last time anyone would see Rosemary alive. So Rosemary had then opened the gate and she had stepped into the garden, and this was around 7 p.m. She was then met by the sight of Phoenix emerging from the house. Phoenix had then approached her with a smile on her face and had given her a big hug. She had then apologized about what happened that morning. It was at this point when Rosemary had her defenses lowered that Kyle had approached from behind her with a rope that he had taken from a pot plant earlier that day. He then apparently lost his nerve, and so Rosemary and Phoenix continued to walk to the house. However, Phoenix then embraced her mother again and she gave Kyle a cold stare. So before Rosemary had a chance to respond to Phoenix's gesture or apology, her air supply was cut off. Rewind. So I'm pretty sure you're wondering how we got to this point. So after Rosemary had left earlier that day, Kyle and Phoenix had sat and pondered different ways to kill Rosemary. Phoenix had suggested hitting her over the head with a spade. However, Kyle had thought that strangling her might be more humane, and so that is the plan of action they went with. Okay, back to the narrative. So it was at this point that Phoenix was gripping her mother quite tightly as Kyle had the rope around her neck. They then walked her to the bedroom and shut the door. So in the bedroom, Kyle continued to hold the rope at her neck while she struggled, while she flailed, while she kicked. Phoenix had apparently then told him not to look at her in her face and to count down from 4 minutes before releasing tension on the rope. So during this time, Phoenix told Kyle not to look at her mother in the face, and Kyle obeyed. A little while later, a huge sigh was emitted from Rosemary and Kyle got quite scared, but Phoenix calmed him down and told him that that was just trapped air leaving her lungs. So at this point, the couple went to go check on Shariel, who was still sleeping. So Phoenix wanted to bury the body immediately. However, Kyle, he was quite horrified at the time and he couldn't bring himself to do it. And they instead put the body into a couple of black bags, and they then took it out to the garden and they covered it with a tarp. So Phoenix then cleaned up the blood that had leaked out of her mom's ear during the strangulation, and Kyle went to go have another hit of crystal meth. He then continued to smoke the entire night, alternating between marijuana and crystal meth. So the next morning, Phoenix awoke. Kyle had not slept. He had been using the whole night, and she asked Kyle to bury the body. He still could not bring himself to do it, and he blamed it on the windy weather. The following day, however, Rosemary's body was wrapped in a pink blanket, and it was buried in quite a shallow grave not too far from the house and the police station. So with the body out the way, the true act began. Soon Phoenix would play the role of the scared daughter, wondering where her mom was and what had happened to her. So missing posters soon went up on social media, and a few days after the murder, Phoenix actually walked into the Fishhook police station to report her mother officially missing. So she had said around 9 p.m. she had seen her mother get into a white Mercedes Benz of a man that she did not know. The search for Rosemary continued, and days turned into weeks. So whilst some were very worried, such as Rosemary's sister Angelique, others simply believed that Rosemary had pulled one of her old stunts, leaving her children to go off on an adventure or a gig, and that she would return after a few days or weeks. Many expected her to return for her 40th birthday and Shariel's 9th birthday, which coincidentally happened to be on the same day, which was the 11th of March. However, she obviously did not show up. Rosemary's mother, Denise, and her sister, Angelique, refused to give up hope during this time. So as time passed, rumors started to spread about what may have happened to Rosemary. Some thought that she may have been taken into the sex trade, whilst others believed that she was too old for the sex trade, but perhaps an ex-boyfriend had taken her in revenge. During this time, people also felt incredibly sorry for the children that were left behind, and they started to gather and donate groceries and money to Phoenix and her sister. So although during this time Kyle was apparently working in a surfing shop in Muizenberg, this money barely covered the basics. So this help was very much appreciated by Phoenix. So in July of 2013, with winter having set into Cape Town, Phoenix decided that it was time that they started a new life, and so her, Shariel, and Kyle left the house in Clovelly and they moved to Gordons Bay. So at this point in time, they were extremely happy, and they even said online how they were sending Shariel to an epic new school where all her teachers really loved her. So at this point, everything was going quite well, and it seemed that the actions of the past would remain just there in the past. So during this time, Kyle, on the other hand, was still using, and so he got it into his mind that the body would be discovered. And so, continuously freaking out about this, he managed to rope in an acquaintance who was living on the property in which they had rented a flat, Godfrey Skippers, and he convinced him to help him move the body. And this is the point that would mark the beginning of the end. So during one night, they drove from Gordons Bay to Clovelly, and they dug up the body that was buried a few meters away from the police station. They then put it into Godfrey's car. So under the cloak of darkness, they then drove around 15 kilometers down Baden-Powell Drive, and in the desolate surroundings, quite close to the Strandfontein Pavilion, they then buried the body. And they left to go back to Gordons Bay. And this would have been it. And perhaps no one would have found the body. But Phoenix and Kyle had no idea what was going to happen next. So in the days that followed, Godfrey began to feel incredibly guilty of the part that he played, and he started to journal and to make notes of all the parts of the murder that Kyle had told him, in a way to almost cathartically get these thoughts out of his head. That didn't work though, and about 2 months after he had helped Kyle move the bodies, he got in his car and he drove to the Fishhook police station. And you know that entire notepad where he had been jotting down his cathartic relief? Yeah, he gave that to the police. It was at this point that he then made a confession. So the police then drove out to the area that Godfrey had pointed out, and they found the decomposing body. About 5 weeks later, DNA tests came back, and it was positively identified as belonging to Rosemary Theron. With Godfrey's confession and the confirmed DNA result, Kyle, Maspero, and Phoenix Racing Cloud Theron were then arrested in late September and charged with murder. So when the young couple appeared in the Simonstown Magistrates Court, one would not think that they were on anything other than a first date. Phoenix had rested her head on Kyle's shoulder, and throughout the proceedings they had been giggling softly amongst one another. Godfrey, however, also in the dock, appeared incredibly sullen. However, a week later when they returned, this was completely different, with Kyle pitching up with a shirt with holes in it and seemingly zoning out throughout the proceedings. Phoenix, on the other hand, was weeping uncontrollably. Both abandoned their bail applications. So upon court resuming on the 2nd of May 2014, Phoenix, at the age of 19 years old, then accepted the plea bargain. So this came as quite a shock to Kyle's defense counsel. It was also at this point that she turned on Kyle, and she said that he had masterminded the murder and that she would be happy to testify against him. So Phoenix was then sentenced to 20 years in prison with 5 years suspended. The judges said that this is a very serious offense, the planned and premeditated murder of her mother. The sentence agreed upon is, in my view, just. This case is where she killed someone near and dear to her, her mother, and it will haunt her for the rest of her life. Phoenix is currently serving her sentence in Polesmore Prison. Godfrey had all of the charges against him withdrawn. So Kyle had actually quite controversially been released and placed under the house arrest of his foster family in Knysna, and this was in March as he awaited his trial in June. So during this time, besides him being very active on social media, he was also spotted out and about by several individuals in Knysna, and one of these just so happened to be a friend of Rosemary, who had actually seen him walking out in the street, and that had upset her quite a bit, as one would imagine. So Kyle was expected to also plead guilty, but he then came with the defense that he could not remember a lot of important details of the murder due to his heavy use of crystal meth in the months preceding the murder and during the murder itself. He was then ordered to be sent for an evaluation at Falkenberg when a bed became available. A bed only became available in 2015, and after he had his 30-day evaluation, it was found that he was declared fit to stand trial. He then appeared back in the dock in October of 2015, and this time he opted for a plea bargain. In his statement, he said, and I quote, "I have no excuse for my conduct, and I acknowledge same to be culpable." His plea bargain earned him 18 years in total, with 5 years being suspended, so essentially only 13 years behind bars. So whilst this was received with quite a bit of shock, especially from Phoenix's family, this was because Kyle was actually only 17 years old at the time of the murder. And according to the Child Justice Act, no life sentence may be imposed on a minor. Kyle Maspero is currently serving his sentence in Pollsmoor prison. So after the murder came to light, Rosemary's mother ended up having to seek treatment for depression at the Stickland Psychiatric Hospital. It's also said that shortly after she lost a leg due to poor circulation as her body's mechanisms just stopped fighting. And if this wasn't enough for one woman to deal with, shortly thereafter she lost her daughter, Rosemary's sister, Angelique. Angelique had been devastated from the day that Rosemary went missing, and it was only 10 days after Rosemary's memorial that at the age of 35 years old, she hanged herself. She left behind her husband and her 3 sons. So a family friend, Michelle, who was visiting Phoenix, then broke the news to her about her aunt. Phoenix was distraught. Michelle says that Phoenix just cries. She cries every day. She's very upset. She realizes her action and she realizes that it was the biggest mistake. So Phoenix's family have actually forgiven her, and they say that she has the support of the community and they want her to know that she is loved. Her grandmother has not yet been to see her. However, they do not forgive Kyle Maspero, and they say that he feels nothing and he feels no guilt towards the actions he has done. So although there is empirical data that shows that the extended use of TIC, or better known as crystal meth, can cause biological and physiological changes to the brain, Kyle did admit that he knew the difference between right and wrong during the time of the murder. So given the difficult childhood that he had, coupled with his drug use, there is a distinct possibility that his idea of right and wrong were significantly warped. Whilst this may be the case, this by no means grants him leniency in the act that he has committed. So although Rosemary was often remembered as being full of love and light, she was also known by Phoenix's father, amongst others, to neglect her children, leaving them with friends for days, sometimes weeks, going off to gigs or parties, and to only come and collect them when she was done. Phoenix had an extremely turbulent childhood, and she existed in a space of neglect and later sexual abuse. So neglect within youth and infancy has a physical effect on early brain development. So this has thus been shown to have the propensity to affect an individual's physical and mental health in both direct and indirect ways. So the immediate effects of the abuse, such as isolation and fear, can have lifelong consequences, such as negative emotional and behavioral changes. So this means that these individuals often experience difficulties within forming relationships and have a higher risk of alcohol and drug use. With the odds stacked against her, Phoenix continued to value her education though, and did whatever she could within her means to succeed. At the end of the day, Phoenix now lives without her mother and with the knowledge of what she has done, serving her sentence in one of the most terrifying prisons in South Africa. And that concludes episode 6 of Makeup and Mayhem True Crime with me, Bella Monsoon. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for the support. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this episode or just the series in general. You can leave those down in the comment section, along with any suggestions that you may have for future episodes. At the moment, I'm focusing on South African true crime. However, if there are some cases that you'd like me to do that are outside of South Africa, I will definitely look into them. Oh, and if you're a true crime addict like me, then please consider subscribing to my channel. It really means so much to me, and if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could leave it a thumbs up. It helps me out so much. You will never ever know, unless you have a YouTube channel, then you will know how it helps. So until next time, my loves, stay safe, stay awesome, and stay blessed. Bye!